Let's see if this is working. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you, and I apologize, it's such a cramped room. Thank you for your perseverance. I suppose a number of you had queued up to come in February when we were all snowed out. And so thank you for your perseverance and commitment, and thank you to the panelists also for coming today. I'm Randy Bluffstone, and I'm the director of the Institute for Economics and Environment here at Portland State. Before introducing our panel, just like to take just a couple of seconds to let you know about our institute, just very briefly, and then we'll just get started. I apologize, it's so crowded in here. So just very briefly, the decision to start the institute, IEE, came out of really a number of discussions here at Portland State and also in the community. And these conversations all led to a conclusion that the territory at the intersection of economics and the environment was big enough that we needed an institution, an intellectual institution here at Portland State to do something in that area. And that's really how IEE came to be. We partner closely with ISS, who are our kind hosts tonight, and also the Portland Institute of Portland Metropolitan Studies. So IEE and our multidisciplinary faculty, what we do is we conduct research and we offer outreach events like this one for the community here at Portland State and in the region. Starting next year, we are planning to offer some targeted executive courses. And the idea there is that we'll offer some training in applied analytical tools like cost-benefit analysis, valuation of environmental benefits, economics of climate change, and empirical methods that people can actually use in their work, particularly on environmental issues. But in this, our first year, we're concentrating on outreach, and we have a total of 5 events. Our Environment, Economics, and You speaker series will conclude. Please come in as best you can. Sorry for the crowding. A couple of seats in the back, I hear, as well. Make yourself as comfortable as you can. Next week, in Smith Memorial Student Union, we'll have a presentation by our own Dave Irvin, who will speak on genetically engineered crops, silver bullet or a shotgun for the environment. That's at 5 o'clock next Thursday. And then I'm also pleased to announce that we have an additional talk by PSU alumnus Robert McCullough, who was recently the subject of a front page article maybe you saw in the Willamette Week, and has been quoted in the New York Times. He'll give a presentation titled "Too Cheap to Meter: Evaluating the Economics of Operating Nuclear Power Plants." And that event will be on April 30th, also at 5 o'clock in Smith Memorial Student Union. To learn more about these events or about our institute, just please visit our website. Please join our email list if you'd like to. And there's also an email list out in the hallway, and you're welcome to pick up some flyers. So before giving a few introductory remarks and introducing the panelists, I'd like to introduce Tom Potowski, who will discuss some important previous work and also move us a little bit into the economics realm. Tom's an ideal person to do this. He's the director of the Northwest Economic Research Center and chair of the economics department here at Portland State, and was also for many years the Oregon State economist. So turn it over to Tom for some remarks.
All right, thank you, Randy. And I'm just going to be very brief and definitely welcome you here to Portland State, and I think what's going to turn out to be a very interesting panel discussion. Now, although, the issue that we're going to be talking about today is not a new issue, and we've had debates concerning surrounding green gas emissions, global warming, have really, and pardon me, recently heated up. And it's almost difficult to avoid any sort of media source that devotes, time to this important issue. Now, one response to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is the implementation of a carbon tax, which we'll be discussing today. Now, this concept is not a new concept. We economists refer to these as Pigovian taxes. It's a tax applied to a market activity that's generating negative externalities. And these negative externalities have costs to society that aren't captured by the market. Now, we've lived with Pigovian taxes for a number of years. If you've ever smoked cigarettes or had alcohol, you've been subject to a Pigovian tax. Now, our panel is going to say a lot more about what a carbon tax means, what are the implications of it, and so I'm not going to go into a boring economic lecture, though the secret is, once you get into it, it really is interesting. But what I want to do is turn now back to, there's been a really strong interest at the federal level to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through a sundry of regulations. And it's only been more recently that they've turned to look at what it might mean to have a carbon tax. Now, the Congressional Budget Office released in May of 2013 a study that was entitled Effects of a Carbon Tax on the Economy and the Environment. Now, the interesting part there, if you notice what that title says, notice the ordering of the words. They said that it's the economy and environment. It wasn't the effects on the environment and the economy. So there is an emphasis on what this means for the economy. And as you may guess, anything that has a dirty three-letter word in it, like tax, is going to cause some political indigestion. So at the federal level, when it comes around to the idea of a carbon tax, we don't get much action in my mind. So hey, it's up to the states, I think, to take the lead. And definitely, I dare say that Oregon is on the forefront of looking at what a carbon tax may mean for the state. As director of the Northwest Economic Research Center, we've been commissioned by the state legislature to look into this issue of what would it be to implement a carbon tax in Oregon, and what are the implications for the economy. Now, Professor Jenny Liu will have more to say about that today. But I really don't want to take up their time. It's just that tonight we're going to take a much closer look at what it means to have a carbon tax for Oregon.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Maybe just before introducing the panelists, I'd just like to set the stage just a second in the general context. As you probably know, the average temperature on the Earth is about 1.25 degrees Fahrenheit than it was before the Industrial Revolution. Now, that might not seem like much, but it's actually a huge change, and most of that has occurred in the last 50 years. So to put this into perspective, I would note that the average temperature is currently by a substantial margin right now above the level that humans have ever experienced before. So as a species, this is the warmest we've ever experienced. And in fact, researchers down the road at Oregon State, in partnership with Harvard University, published results last March that indicated the world right now is hotter than about 75% of the last 11,000 years. So we're starting to build up some big numbers here, and not surprisingly, we're starting to see some big effects. Now, this warming is the result of human activity, particularly the burning of fossil fuels that were previously locked up underground. This is made very clear by the recent IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. They make it clear that it's the result of our actions. And as a result of those actions, the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere have increased by 40% since the Industrial Revolution began. Now, the numbers are small, 280 parts per million to 400 parts per million, but that's enough. Again, it doesn't sound like much, but based on ice core evidence, this is more than the Earth has seen in the last 500,000 years. So the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere are more than it's been in the last 500,000 years. So to paraphrase Harvard economist Martin Weitzman, what we're really doing here is we're conducting an unprecedented and dangerous, uncontrolled experiment with the whole planet. And the IPCC report says that we need to start now. We need urgent action in Oregon, the United States, and around the world to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly emissions of CO2 from burning fossil fuels. And that's responsible for about half the climate change, the CO2 emissions. So this brings us to our panel today. Carbon taxes, as Tom mentions, are being actively considered here in Oregon, and they're part of a policy package that were discussed about 2 months ago by Angus Duncan, who's here in the audience today, to reduce carbon emissions and tax bad things like pollution rather than good things like our wages. So they therefore could potentially both improve our ailing tax system while also serving as an important complement to existing efforts by changing incentives for every time Oregonians face decisions whether or not to use fossil fuels. to weigh those decisions and ask whether we really need to emit them or not. If we enact a carbon tax, it will directly and explicitly ask us to consider every time if we need to do this. So it's kind of like when you go in to buy something and you know, a restaurant meal or something, and you find out one day that it's more expensive than you expected because those inputs to create that meal or produce that product became more expensive. And you say, well, you know, maybe I should think twice about doing that. Well, that's what we need here, potentially, in the carbon realm. This tells us rightly that our stable climate is getting pretty scarce, and we may need to scale back a bit on our use of it. Now, that's the idea. We all know that, perhaps, but the implementation and the politics are the tricky part. And so to help us think through these complexities, the Institute was very, very pleased to introduce our distinguished panelists who have all worked on this for many years. I'd like to warmly thank all of them for giving their time today. Jana Gastelum, at the second from the end, is Program Director for Climate Protection at the Oregon Environmental Council. She's been there since 2010 and leads the state and regional work to build a low-carbon and equitable economy. Many things I could say. She holds a BS and master's degree in Earth Systems from Stanford University. Jenny Liu, who was mentioned, is Assistant Director of the Northwest Economic Research Center and Assistant Professor in the School of Urban Studies and Planning here at Portland State. She holds PhD and Master of Science degrees in Agriculture and Resource Economics from UC Berkeley. She's an environmental and natural resource economist focusing primarily on transportation economics, but also alternative energy sources and the linkages between transportation and urban development. She's the co-author with Jeff Renfro and perhaps others on the tax study that Tom highlighted. Jenny is at the far end of the table. Michael Armstrong, right here next to Tom, is Senior Sustainability Manager with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability here in the city of Portland. He's been there for 14 years, but he's also worked in other countries, 3 years in Southern Africa and Cape Town, and also in Namibia. He has his master's in public administration from Indiana University and a bachelor's from Cornell. Yoram Bauman in the middle is the world's first and only stand-up economist. But he's also holds a PhD from University of Washington, and he's part of carbonwa.org, that's working to bring a revenue-neutral carbon tax to Washington State. Yoram is the author of several books, and maybe I'll tell you a little bit about them, but the one that I'd like to focus on is called Tax Shift, which was written with Alan Durning of the Sightline Institute, and it helped to inspire the revenue-neutral carbon tax in British Columbia. Yoram lives in Seattle. He has a BA in math from Reed and a PhD, as I mentioned, from UW. So I thank again all panelists for coming today. Each panelist will have 15 minutes for remarks. After that, we'll just open it up to the audience for questions. We anticipate having about 45 minutes for questions. So to get us started, I'd like to invite Jana to come up and give her presentation, followed by Jenny, Michael, and Yoram. So if you could please hit the light switch right behind you so that we can see the PowerPoint better. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. This is great to see such a packed house. My name is Jana Gastelum. I'm the Program Director for Climate Protection at the Oregon Environmental Council, and I'm actually filling in for some very small but metaphorically large shoes. Jackie Dingfelder was supposed to be on the panel but was called away to participate in the Clinton Global Initiative Infrastructure Conference that was happening on the other side of the country. So I just want to acknowledge Jackie and the work that she did to serve the state and the legislature. We miss her from the legislature, but we're glad that she's still at the city of Portland. I'm going to just sort of lay the groundwork for some of this conversation, but I do want to let you know who the Oregon Environmental Council is. We are a statewide environmental nonprofit. We've been at work in the state for 40 years, and we tend to work at the intersection of environmental and human issues. And our program areas include protecting kids from toxins, improving the stewardship of Oregon's rivers. My program is global warming, creating sustainable food and farm systems, and then underpinning all of that is building a sustainable and equitable economy. And we also work with individuals to help you all express your environmental values. We work with professionals to embed sustainability concepts into business practices. And then we also work at the systems level to work with elected officials so that we're really impacting the way we do things at a higher level. And we do this both at the state level, at the regional level, and then of course, ultimately, we want to impact federal legislation as well. I think this audience is probably fairly well educated on this, but every once in a while I come across an audience that says, I care about climate change, but what is that with carbon taxes? I don't quite understand the link. So I think we all know this, but carbon just being a shorthand for carbon dioxide, which is the main greenhouse gas pollutant that causes climate change. And when we talk about pricing carbon, there are a couple of different mechanisms that really can be at play to do that. We can do that through a carbon tax, which we'll talk about tonight, but we'll also, you can also do that effectively through a cap and trade program. There's different mechanisms, but both can be used to reduce climate pollution. And we're all here tonight because carbon pricing is seen as an effective way to bring down emissions to controllable levels. It's an efficient and effective way to get to a problem. There are a lot of other policies that also matter, so there's no silver bullet. But this one is really intriguing in the scope of what can be done and the efficacy. I'll let the other economists who are much more qualified than I to talk about exactly how that can work. But I think it's an exciting time to be working in this space, and I think we have a great opportunity here in Oregon to further this conversation. Carbon pricing conversations have been happening at the federal level for a long time, but carbon taxes are sort of taking on, I think, a new urgency and interest across the political spectrum, which I will touch on a little bit later as well. So what have been the drivers for carbon pricing in Oregon? People, of course, have known about the importance of climate change for a long time, but more recently in Oregon, in 2007, the state established climate targets. We said we will stabilize our emissions in 2010. We will reduce our emissions 10% below 1990 levels by 2020. That's in line with Kyoto Protocol. And by 2050, we want to reduce our emissions at least 75% below those 1990 levels. So that's enshrined in our statute. It's not mandatory, but it is our goals and our targets. And our first sort of bite at the carbon pricing apple was back in 2009 when we were part of the Western Climate Initiative, and we were going to join sort of a 7-state region in looking at doing a regional cap and trade program. There is a cap and trade program that is alive and well on the East Coast, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. California has a cap and trade program, and they'll be linking up with a Canadian province. But Oregon failed to pass enabling legislation back in 2009. It's still, I think, important to keep track of these initiatives. We're seeing some really impressive results, especially from the RGGI states. There was a presentation to our legislature about the benefits of a cap and trade program in this last session. So again, it's another important mechanism to keep on the table. So where are we at making progress towards our greenhouse goals? And this is care of, someone else mentioned Angus Duncan earlier, the chair of the Global Warming Commission. This is a slide that I have stolen from him. But it just lets you know where we are in our progress. So this was our business as usual with greenhouse gas emissions, with things like federal CAFE standards that sort of business as usual line has come down. And we have a number of policies that are already in place that will continue to help us reduce our emissions. Some of them have to do with our amazing energy efficiency programs. We can do more there to meet all new load growth. We have a renewable portfolio standard that gives us 25% renewables by 2025. It was under threat this last session and was ably defended. Very popular renewables are amongst the public. We're going to be phasing out our Boardman, our single coal-fired power plant in the state, and we'd like to see that replaced with a clean energy mix. And we have something called the Clean Fuels Program, which looks at the transportation side of the equation. But so the red line is where we're at now with existing policies, and this green line is where we need to be. And we need to figure out how we're going to fill in that gap. And there could be a very strong and important role for carbon pricing to play there. So other drivers for carbon pricing in Oregon. There is an active conversation right now about revenue reform. Oregon relies very heavily on personal and income taxes, property taxes. We don't have a sales tax, and that has been troublesome for things like funding schools and other things. So there's an active revenue reform conversation. And so people are taking a new look at carbon pricing within that context. And now we actually have legislation that also has us directed to look at this more fully. And so I want to talk a little bit about how that legislation came to be. But I couldn't do this without noting, and you're going to see probably this slide a lot, but the NERC team really did an amazing job laying out sort of a baseline analysis for looking at a carbon tax in Oregon. And without this type of really data-driven conversation, I think we wouldn't be where we are now. So I really want to thank the NERC, the PSU team, for their excellent work, and just acknowledge how important it is to have good analytical thinking going into this. Ginny, I'm sure, will get into more details about this study, so I will leave it at that. But I commend that study to you. So how did we come to have this legislative process? Well, SB 306 was a bipartisan bill. It was co-authored by Senator Dingfeld and Senator Boquist. They were the two chief authors. Senator Boquist is a Republican from the McMinnville area, and as someone else mentioned earlier, there's interest in figuring out how we can shift our tax system away from things that we do want, like income and wages, and to things that we want less of, like pollution. There's also a strong interest to figure out more sustainable revenue needs to fill in the gaps where we have them. I'll jump down to the coalition effort. So this was also really a strong business-led effort as well. So the Oregon Business Association was one of the main groups that really lobbied for this effort. And in part, again, if we're thinking about a strong and stable Oregon economy, we need to think about long-term issues, such as education funding. If we don't have a well-educated workforce, we don't have a strong and stable economy in the long run as well. So as part of this overall revenue reform conversation, business was very interested in making sure that we take a look at this. Oregon Environmental Council was also at the table in thinking through this bill design. But we also were able to pull from places that already had experience. The BC Minister of the Environment came down to talk about British Columbia's experience. And this was important because it was really a right-of-center government in British Columbia that passed the carbon tax up there. It's been in place and it's been successful. And it was really important, I think, for our legislators to hear from leaders in another jurisdiction that had already done this and to understand that this can be done in a way that can have multiple benefits both for the environment and the economy. So in the end, it was a bipartisan bill. In the Senate, there were 2 Republicans that joined all of the Democrats to pass it. In the House, it was a little bit more along party lines, but in the end, I think Oregon is in a good place for having had a bipartisan discussion and support for the study bill. So the study bill, the final report will be due in November. We hope that there will be a legislative proposal in 2015. But I want to zoom out a little bit more and also just provide a little more context quickly. Our governor has been part of the Pacific Coast Collaborative, which is the leadership from British Columbia, Oregon, Washington, and California. And back in October, Governor Kitzhaber signed what's known as the Pacific Coast Action Plan on Climate, which signaled strong support from leaders in these 4 jurisdictions to maintain or implement carbon pricing along the West Coast. And these 4 jurisdictions represent the 5th largest economy in the world, and so there's real market power and market share there. And so it shows that there is leadership at the highest levels really dedicated to thinking through this issue. And again, this is why it is so exciting to be part of these conversations, why I think Oregon is in a good position to lead on this issue. We also have, at the federal level, regulatory standards. The EPA has carbon pollution standards issued already for new power plants, and they're in the process of developing rules for existing power plants. And why this is important is that there already are existing conversations about using existing mechanisms like cap and trade as a way to meet these federal standards. And there's a potential opening for carbon pricing to be a new compliance pathway as well. And again, these rules are just being written and proposed. But what's significant about this, I was back in Washington, D.C., talking to various economists and other folks who work on climate regulation and some of the international negotiations. But their feeling was, if there is real effort around carbon pricing that could potentially get embedded in EPA's carbon regulations, that shows that the U.S. is committed in a new way to regulating carbon, and that there's an actual price signal. And that could have significant impact on our international negotiations, because it shows a different kind of commitment from the U.S.'s part. And so while we sometimes think of Oregon as being a very small state, we could have a real impact, I think, rippling through what happens at both a federal level and potentially an international level, because ultimately that's where we need to get. So I think absolutely Oregon can and should lead on this issue. And I think that it's always best to sort of have a seat at the table. I used to work with farmers and foresters, and they always said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so I think that's wise counsel for all of us to think about how can we really be, at the head of the table on this. And I think with, the great intellectual resources that we have at places like PSU, that's really enabling us to lead some of these conversations. And certainly we're getting calls from our advocacy counterparts in other states saying, hey, what is happening in Oregon? How can we do something similar? So we know that we are already having a ripple effect. And then the last thing I want to end on is it's easy to talk about some of these things in a vacuum. Should we have a price? Should we not have a price? But I think it's important to remember that not acting on climate change has a real impact and cost. And it starts to get personal. So this is all that's left of the front door of my aunt and uncle's house. They were in Black Forest, Colorado during one of the most severe forest fire seasons. And I think it actually won't be very long before most of us know someone who's been impacted by climate change, whether it's someone who has a shellfish hatchery along our Oregon and Washington coast, whether it's someone who loses a home in an extreme weather event or a forest fire. So there's real urgency to make sure that we make progress on this. It's not just simply an intellectual exercise. This makes a real difference to people's individual lives. So I hope that we lead not only from a policy perspective, but also from a moral perspective, that we know that this is about all of us and about all of our homes. So please continue to join the conversation. You can join OEC or sign up for our publications if you want to stay informed and know about opportunities to weigh in with our decision makers. And this is me, how to get a hold of me. I forgot to bring cards, but there's my contact information. And this is my picture of riding off into the sunset as my final adios and adieu. Thank you for the opportunity to present tonight, and I will look forward to questions later.
All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Jenny Liu, as Tom and Randy have introduced, and I think Jana's presentation gives a pretty good segue into what we did last year as part of this carbon tax and shift study that came out last year in March. And this was co-authored by me and my colleague Jeff Renfro, who couldn't be here, but also directed under Dr. Tom Potowski. And this was really one of the first efforts to really take a closer look at how would implementing a carbon tax could impact Oregon's economy and also how it can impact greenhouse gas emissions, getting us closer to our greenhouse gas emission goals. So what I'm going to be presenting today is going to be some of the results from our study. And we are also continuing work on this particular front, working with the Legislative Revenue Office on this. But my presentation will focus on what we've already done last year in our first study. So to really start, I want to tell you what our study objectives were. What we really wanted to do was to take a look at what would be a reasonable carbon tax level and what would the tax base be. So who would we be charging this carbon tax on? And then the second was, after we do collect this kind of carbon tax, where would this revenue go and how can we structure it such that we could potentially stimulate some economic development here in Oregon instead of harming it from a carbon tax perspective. And then third, to look overall at the economic and greenhouse gas impacts. How much of a carbon tax would we need in order to get to some of our goals? And finally, we also took a look at some of the equity issues concerned with having a carbon tax. As you might imagine, it is a rather regressive kind of tax. So we took a look at some of those issues as well. So to start with the first particular objective, we really had a very good example that we could follow from to figure out what carbon tax level and what carbon tax base, because our neighbors to the north, British Columbia, was one of the first provincial or regional carbon tax regions that really captured almost all sources of combustion of fossil fuels that produce greenhouse gases in the world. There are very few other places that have this broad of a tax base and captures this many emitters of greenhouse gases. So this was a really unique example, and it had been in place since 2008, which gave us some data to see how they did it, what are the levels, what are the impacts to their economy. So when they started in 2008, it was at $10 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, and they increased it gradually, and now it's at $30 per ton. And they designed it on their end as a revenue neutral carbon tax, which meant that all of the revenue coming in from the carbon tax was then repatriated or given back into the economy through some mechanism. And this is really where we based our study on, because there was a successful example right very close by to us. So we based our study off of this. How can we take this kind of carbon tax and structure it for Oregon? So here's some data on how much revenues they collected, as well as how much repatriation or how much money was given back to the economy for the last two most recent fiscal years. And you can see that the revenue, the level of revenue is quite substantial. It's close to $1 billion. These are actually Canadian dollars. So close to $1 billion in revenue, and then they repatriated back more than $1 billion. And this was not necessarily on purpose. It was because the repatriation was really based on forecasts of how much they would collect in carbon tax revenues. And obviously with forecasts, as you all must know well, that forecasts are not always consistent with what actually happens. But they're working to close this gap a little bit, because what their objective was to begin with was to design a revenue neutral carbon tax. So part of what they designed their repatriation, so where they would give money back to the economy, was distributed in several different ways, one of which is to reduce business and corporate income taxes. So they reduced that. The other main mechanism to go back to the economy is to reduce personal income taxes as well. So they reduced personal income tax brackets by 5% for the lowest two brackets, and they also provided low-income assistance, as well as several other smaller categories of rural households or other types of small business assistance. But mainly it went to business income tax cuts and personal income tax cuts. And that's what's projected to happen going forward as well. So this was a really good experience to look at, because if you notice, they started in 2008. And that was when we experienced the Great Recession. And through this, and even with the recession going on, what we saw in British Columbia was that they cut overall greenhouse gas emissions and fuel consumption, and they also cut greenhouse gas emissions on a per capita basis as well, all at the same time, their economy fared better than the rest of Canada during the same period. So that was a pretty positive result for us to see that this was going on, and that was what we would base our model on. So we decided to go from here and take a look at what would happen if we did it in Oregon. So before we did our analysis, this graph really shows you who is going to be paying the most of the greenhouse gas emissions tax or a carbon tax. So on the left-hand side here, you can see that the majority of our greenhouse gas emissions comes from the transportation sector. And without any calculation or any analysis, you know that if there was a carbon tax instituted, transportation would be paying the bulk of it. And the other for residential, commercial, and industrial would be paying lesser portions because they're emitting less greenhouse gases. But if you took a look on the right-hand side at the distribution of employment here in Oregon, you can see that even though transportation accounts for the majority of our greenhouse gas emissions, it actually only is 2% of our overall Oregon employment levels. So that means that they will be paying the bulk of it, but the employment impacts are not going to be as significant as how much they're paying into it, just because they're not hiring that many people. Okay, so let me get into some of our modeling. So if you looked at this graph, this is kind of going off of what Jana's graph was. So on here, the green line that you see on here are our 1990 emission levels here in Oregon. And our legislation has said that we are to drop, or our goal is to drop to 90% of 1990 levels by 2020. And so this is our business as usual emissions forecast going forward. So we took a look at several different carbon tax levels to see how far will we get with this particular policy. So this red line is a $30 per ton. So it increases gradually to $30 per ton, but you can see that it's still pretty far from that objective level. And then a $60 per ton gets us a little closer, but we still don't get there with just this particular policy in place. And then we took a look at what if we did $100 per ton? And you can see that this final purple line does cross over the 1990 emissions level in around 2029, but still, it shows that even with pretty high carbon tax prices, it may not be the only tool that should be in the toolkit to get us to our greenhouse gas emissions or climate change goals. So going off of that, we decided to kind of focus our modeling on the sort of the middle of the road scenario, because $30 is obvious that we will not get close to our emission goals. $100 seem to be pretty high on a worldwide scale. No one has charged a carbon price of $100 per ton yet, so we decided to focus more on the $60, even though we did modeling on all of these different levels. So if we did that, then in 2015, so if we started in 2013 at a level of $10 and we increased by $10 every year, eventually getting up to $60 per ton in 2018, that would mean that we would generate revenues of $1 billion by 2015 and up to $2 billion in 2025. And that, just to put it in perspective, our state general fund plus lottery revenue or budget in the most current biennium, so on an annual basis, that's about $7-point-something billion. So this is a good chunk of money. It's not insubstantial to be considered. So, so given that, we need to consider not only how high of a tax level, but also what might we want to do with this potential carbon tax revenue. So we took a look at various scenarios that are a combination of all of these various things. So we looked at giving it back to consumers. We looked at giving it back through corporate income tax cuts as well. We looked at also specifically targeting investments to, say, transportation infrastructure that would be potential substitutes for people moving away from cars, for example, and as well as energy efficiency investments. And we also looked at specific low-income provisions that would sort of alleviate this problem of the regressivity of this particular tax. So we ran a whole bunch of different scenarios, but I will present to you a couple of these scenario outcomes and what they do to our overall economy here in Oregon. So these are three scenarios. Two of these are pretty extreme. So we wanted to show what are the different trade-offs that can happen if you gave all of this money back to corporations or all of it to personal income taxes and see what would happen. And it's not really a scenario that we would recommend, but it's really to illustrate what could happen. So in this first left-hand side here, if we gave it all back in terms of corporate income tax cuts, we would see potentially very positive employment impacts in the commercial industry and smaller negative impacts in the transportation and industrial sector. Residential is almost not affected. It's negligible here. And this is because if you give money back through corporate income tax cuts, there are bound to be some multiplier effects and investments going on in the corporate sector. If we gave it all back into personal income tax cuts, as you can see in the middle scenario here, what would happen is that we would see more negative impacts overall to the economy. And this is more or less due to the fact that if you give more money to people, they may or may not invest that money, they may or may not spend it. There's a lower propensity to consume for personal. So there's less multiplier effects throughout the economy due to that particular effect. So since we illustrated these two extremes, we wanted to say, okay, what if we split up the money into two pots and say half to the corporations, half to personal? And you can see that the effects are sort of somewhere in between these two particular extreme scenarios. And then we started playing more with all of the numbers, and we came up with more scenarios that are a little bit more complicated. And both of these scenarios incorporate some low-income tax credits that So to make some of the low-income households more or less whole in terms of their increased energy expenditures. And then we split up the rest of the money in terms of corporate tax cuts, personal tax cuts, and then also targeted investments. And you can see that these are more or less a combination of the effects that were shown on the previous slide. And there are going to be pretty positive results in the commercial sector and a bit of a negative result in the transportation sector. And this particular slide kind of summarizes all of this into just overall employment impacts with this kind of revenue repatriation schemes. So you can see that possibly giving it all back into personal income tax cuts is potentially going to be problematic for the Oregon economy in terms of job impacts. It's going to create more job losses than all of these other scenarios that we modeled. But that being said, more modeling and more thinking through a lot of these scenarios is being done, and we're working on that right now. So I think that is the end of my presentation. And I think there is a lot more detail to the report and the study that we did, and you can find that on NERC's website. I don't have it up here. It's at www.pdx.edu/NERC, N-E-R-C. And our full report is on there, and we're very open to questions and suggestions and input from everyone. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so Randy, I think moving into this room has just provided an experience in which we will all remember as not liking warm temperatures. So that as we all start to fade and pass out, and anybody who's not yet asleep. So I'm Michael Armstrong. As Randy said, I work for the City of Portland. I should be clear, I will offer you a few opinions that are my own. If you want to know what the City of Portland thinks, you should ask City Council, and I would encourage you to do so. So I will be clear that the city is very interested in this issue and has done a little bit of work on it. We are intending and expecting to engage in the state conversation and we are very interested in seeing it succeed there. You know, obviously, we would prefer a national carbon price. Short of that, and how long are we going to wait? Let's work on the state level. Perhaps we can make it happen. We're committed to do it. Short of that, we should look at it regionally. We should look at it locally. We don't have time to say we're not going to do these things, but let's see if we can get it done at the best levels possible. So I'll be relatively brief, and I only have a couple of slides just to illustrate one or two things. But I want to leave you with I want to underscore a couple different points. So we should do this, but we should not necessarily expect it to be a game changer. And I think you see that from some of the slides that Jenny shared. You know, the question is, to tax or not to tax is not the question. That's the politics of it. The question is, how do we tax and what do we do with the revenue? And that's really where the policy side of this needs to get figured out. And then obviously we have to work backwards into the politics of it. But I really want to underscore that you know, a carbon tax alone, it is not necessarily a game changer in terms of the benefits. It's certainly not a game changer in terms, you know, it's not a catastrophe. And the illustration of that I want to offer is, you know, energy prices are very volatile, right? We've all experienced this. This is electricity prices for the utilities serving Portland, Pacific Power, and PGE over on the right. Cents per kilowatt hour in total revenue. This is for all customer classes, so add about $0.015 if you want to know residential rates. You know, big changes over the last 10 years or so. There have been ups and some downs, but I want to add in the effect of just using $10 a ton carbon, rough numbers, and I use 10 because the math is easy, but let me add in what $10 per ton of carbon does to these. So for Pacific, you get about $0.01 extra. For PGE, maybe half a cent. Again, rough numbers. And so you compare that increment to the volatility we've seen recently, and we've got new rate cases coming. The tax alone doesn't send a strong enough price signal. So this really needs to be about what we do with the revenue and what kinds of programs there are to support this. So one of my points I want to leave you with is the carbon tax alone is inadequate, and we really need to be focused on the programs, either with or without the revenue, because that's a separate conversation. But to the extent that we've got revenue to deliver programs, we need to figure out what programs are going to work. And this gets me to the related point, which is carbon reduction alone is inadequate. So carbon tax alone is inadequate, and carbon reduction alone is inadequate. And what I mean by that is we need to address climate change globally because it is causing human suffering today, and it's going to cause a whole lot more human suffering going forward. And we have the ability to be at the high end of the human suffering or the low end of the human suffering. As we work on reducing carbon and trying to alleviate that larger human suffering, we ought to be making sure that the ways we're reducing carbon are benefiting people and they are not compounding the suffering. So when we're doing our carbon reduction activities, we need to be very, very clear about the ways those connect to jobs, the ways those connect to equity, the ways those connect to community priorities. So as we're designing our carbon tax, I want to really underscore, you know, that we need to do this in a way to make sure we're achieving overall benefits for a prosperous, equitable community. And, you know, you can offer plenty of models of carbon reduction that are, you know, they've got a fantastic emissions curve, but it's not for any of the reasons we want. So we got Russia, we got Detroit, and we just need to be really clear about the goals we're trying to achieve with our carbon policy. And so as we put a tax into place, as we put programs into place, let's be really clear that the goals need to address carbon, they need to address jobs, they need to address affordability, they need to address equity. Sometimes there's tension among those, and that's okay. That's what we do in public policy. And sometimes, and I think often it's the case with carbon issues, those things align. And so we should be really deliberate about the goals we're trying to achieve with that. All right. The last thing I want to talk about for a couple minutes. So the City of Portland has done a little bit of work on this. Some private parties conducted a poll to test public appetite locally for something like a carbon tax. And the big takeaway is the unsurprising notion that language matters a lot. And if you just ask people if they support a carbon tax, in Portland, they do. And as you work down to exactly how you want to phrase that, you get a lot of opinions, even though you're still just talking about a carbon tax. Excuse me. So one nugget I will offer, testing kind of various ways of characterizing what exactly it is you're placing a price on. The poll looked at a number of different phrasings, and the one that received the most support was a tax on polluters, and the one that received the least support was a pollution tax. And in between, there were 8 or 10, I don't remember, I didn't have the whole thing, 8 or 10 different phrasings. But tax on polluters and pollution tax were the bookends. So words matter enormously. And this kind of goes back to the politics of this. We have the challenge of both solving this from a policy perspective, because it's not simple. And the work Jenny's doing is incredibly useful in helping us design something that really can deliver net benefits, economic, potentially equity, potentially carbon as well. We need to design something that delivers net benefits from a policy perspective that obviously is doable politically as well. Is there overlap between those spheres? That's all of our collective challenge. But the language matters intensely, and we only get there by beginning to put this stuff together and talking it through. So I'm standing, sweating between you and a stand-up comedian. So I'm going to sit down and look forward to the discussion. So thank you.
I'm sorry to disappoint, but I'm not going to be funny tonight. I will, however, summarize. Sorry. First of all, I want to say that I really I think it's amazing that so many people are out here tonight. So thank you so much for coming, especially those of you who are standing and waiting your way through this. I sort of have 3 goals in life, and one of them is to implement carbon pricing. So that's one of the reasons I'm here tonight. My other goals are to spread joy to the world through economics comedy, which I'll hopefully do another time. And then reforming economics education is the third goal. So I should just briefly mention that I have a couple of cartoon economics books, and I'm actually working on a cartoon book about climate change that's coming out in June. I'm hoping to do a couple of events here in Portland. I noticed that there's a typo on my website. It should be standupeconomist.com. We'll fix that. There we go. So I will say that I have I've been working with Sightline Institute, where I'm a carbon tax fellow, on a series of blog posts about carbon pricing, and as part of one that we're working on, I've come up with a haiku to describe the British Columbia carbon tax, which really is it is an amazing policy, I think, and we played a very, very small role in getting the ball rolling, but it's something that I'm super proud of to have had even a very small role in. So here's the haiku for the BC carbon tax. Fossil CO2, $30 for each ton, revenue neutral. Our next blog post is going to be about California's cap and trade system, which is more like War and Peace. It's very extensive. So I will be sharing with you some work that I've been doing about carbon taxes in Washington State, and I will do my best also to keep comments brief, because I think mostly what you're here for is to think about how the lessons that we've been thinking about, what we've been thinking about in Washington State applies here in Oregon. So some basics, very roughly, you take Washington, you divide in half, and you add a little bit, and you get Oregon. Okay, so Washington population, take it in half, add a little bit, you get Oregon. State GDP in Washington, $375 billion. The government's about, state government budget's about 10% of that. State tax collections about $16 billion. So Jenny said earlier that state tax collections in Oregon about $7.2 billion. So you take the 16, you divide by half, you add a little bit, or in that case, I guess you subtract a little bit. Depends on how you measure it, right? And then fossil fuel carbon emissions in Washington State, about 85 million metric tons of CO2 per year. And so if you just do the simple math, you take a $30 per ton of CO2 carbon tax, which is what British Columbia has, that's sort of the target that I'm going to use, you're going to generate about $2 billion a year in revenue. You'll reduce emissions by 10 or 15%. So that's, you take the $2 billion, you look at it from a revenue perspective, you're looking at 10 to 20% of state government revenue, which is in the same ballpark that Jenny was talking about here for Oregon. So it's a substantial amount, but it's not an overwhelming amount relative to state government revenues. You're not going to be able to eliminate the income tax in Oregon. You're not going to be able to eliminate the sales tax in Washington State. Sales tax in Washington State generates about $7.2 billion a year. So what could you do with a $30 per ton of CO2 carbon tax, and how do you sort of think about that? And let me just say, so $30 per ton of CO2, let me put it in numbers that, that may make more sense to you. $30 per ton of CO2, very rough ballparks, 30 cents a gallon of gasoline, 3 cents a kilowatt hour of coal-fired power, half that for natural gas. Okay. So that's roughly what we're talking about from $30 per ton of CO2, and you scale them and you get roughly what, when Michael has his slides up about electricity, there's a lot of coal-fired power that comes especially from Pacific Power, so he was looking at $10 per ton equaling about 1 penny per kilowatt hour. I think that's a bit high for the mix from Pacific Power, but it's ballpark, right? So those are the sorts of numbers that we're talking about. So they're pretty substantial, right? And especially if you start thinking about the political ramifications of adding 30 cents to the price of gasoline, that's a challenge. Right. Okay, so if we're talking about serving up a carbon tax, I think the way to think about it, the way that I encourage folks to think about it is you're funding a big entree, and then you got a couple of side dishes that you can fund. Okay. So a lot of this is about, all right, we have the carbon tax, and the amazing thing about carbon pricing is the environmental policy is the carbon price. You just happen to get this pile of revenue that comes out of it at the end that you can do stuff with. And you can put that money towards clean energy, you can put that money towards a lot of other things also. And so I think politically a lot of the attractiveness of carbon pricing is going to be from what do you do with the revenue. So that's a lot of the political game. The political thinking comes in, all right, how do we design a package of a carbon price plus revenue allocation, recycling, repatriation, however you want to call it, that's going to make the entire package attractive. And the way that I would encourage you to think about this is you're going to be funding a big entree that's going to provide broad benefits for everybody. And then you're going to be funding some side dishes. That's going to target specific segments of the population, the individuals or businesses that are relatively strongly affected by carbon tax. And so if you think about this in terms of what Jenny was talking about, the big entrees would be personal income tax reductions, corporate income tax reductions in the state of Oregon. Those provide big, broad-based benefits for sort of everybody. I would argue that the side dishes you need to target would be low-income households, Jenny also mentioned this, and probably energy-intensive trade-exposed businesses. Okay, I wouldn't worry so much about transportation because everybody's got to pay transportation, trucking fees, and things like this. But if you're in a business in Oregon that's competing with a business outside of Oregon, and you're an energy-intensive business, that's something to worry about. If you're going to pay the carbon tax and they're not going to pay the carbon tax. So the low-income households, number of ideas here, but you could, for example, fund a state-level bump up of the federal earned income tax credit, largest anti-poverty program in the United States. Oregon has a little bump up of the federal EITC. It's very small. You could expand that. That's one way to provide some offsets for low-income households. Energy-intensive businesses, what we looked at doing in Washington State is actually eliminating the B&O tax, the business tax in Washington State for manufacturers. So, energy-intensive businesses, you're talking essentially about manufacturers are very high on that list. They pay taxes, and so we have a crazy tax system in Washington State. The business tax, so we have a sales tax, we have no income tax, we have no corporate income tax, but we do have what's called a B&O tax, business and occupation tax in Washington State. It is a gross receipts tax, so even if you don't make any profits, you pay a tax just as a percentage of revenue. That's the way we do things up north. Nobody likes it. So we could eliminate the B&O tax for manufacturers in Washington State. Not for all businesses, but for manufacturers. In which case you'd get you'd get manufacturers paying taxes based on how much carbon they emit instead of based on how much revenue they generate. Which you think about it as a way of lining up social goals with private incentives works a lot better. Right? So those are a couple things to think about in terms of the side dishes. I would add one other caveat politically. I think it's important to think about agriculture. So I can tell you in Washington State, ag uses some fossil fuels. The list that I've seen of sort of the most fossil fuel intensive businesses does not include ag, but ag screams very loudly. Right? Politically, they're very powerful. And the challenge that we've dealt with in Washington State in terms of trying to devise a revenue neutral carbon tax, as in British Columbia, it is very difficult. We would like to find something like the B&O tax for ag and reduce that tax for agriculture to sort of make it even out for them. But ag doesn't pay any B&O tax. Ag doesn't pay any sales tax. Ag pays reduced property taxes. It is very difficult to find offsetting tax reductions for agriculture. So that is a huge challenge, and we're looking at providing an exemption for on-farm diesel, which I'm not, as an economist, I'm not super thrilled with, because you want to provide across-the-board incentives for everybody, but it's been a tough nut to crack. In terms of, so that's the side dishes. In terms of the big entrees, in Washington State, you're talking roughly $1 billion a year, right, from a $30 per ton of CO2 carbon tax for your entree. Okay. So I would argue that you should think about this kind of like from a Goldilocks kind of perspective, right? You don't want to be kind of too big, you don't want to be too small, you want to be just right. So education, I would argue, is too big, right? $1 billion a year is not enough in Washington State to really, it's just not like, we went and talked to the education people and they weren't all that excited about it. Right? Education is just, education is roughly half of state budgets. Right? So it is a huge, huge amount of money. So education, I would argue, is too big. I would argue that energy efficiency and clean energy are too small. I think that's an attractive side dish potentially. And I may get some pushback from folks on this, but I think if you think about the context of a carbon tax generating if the entree size is $1 billion a year, I just don't know how you spend that money effectively on energy efficiency, on clean energy. Maybe Jana has ideas. Maybe other folks have ideas about how to do that. But it is a vast pile of money. Right? That is a huge chunk of money. I think in addition, you have some political challenges in that you're not really expanding your political coalition if you put the money from a carbon tax towards energy efficiency as an entree. Just right in Washington State, I would present two options. So here's what I would argue are sort of Goldilocks just right. Option number one is you reduce the state sales tax by a full percentage point. So in very broad strokes, what this would do is people are going to pay a couple $100 more a year for fossil fuels. Households will pay a few $100s more a year for fossil fuels and a few $100s a year less for everything else. So in Washington State, again, we have sales tax, no income tax. You could think about something similar with income taxes here in Oregon. And I should note that in Washington, the sales tax, businesses actually pay 30–40% of the sales tax in Washington. So it's not just something that households pay. So I would argue that that's sort of in the ballpark. The other thing I would argue that's in the ballpark, and this moves away from revenue neutrality, but it's in the ballpark in terms of the Goldilocks perspective and also has an interesting political angle, is transportation funding. And in Washington State, the annual maintenance shortfall is about $1 billion a year, which again is right in our ballpark in terms of the revenue needs. As Jenny mentioned, transportation generates about half of the revenue from a carbon tax. Not all that is from roads, but a substantial portion of that is from roads. So combining a carbon tax to fund maintenance is potentially politically attractive, and you can see how that might bring in some support from business, from labor, things like that. Obviously, there are challenges here. If you think about, for example, the Columbia River crossing, just to pick an example, there might be some folks in the environmental community who are not all that keen on funding the Columbia River crossing, both in Washington and in Oregon. But I would argue that that's something to think about. A couple of details to ponder. One is about implementation. So I would argue that to the extent possible, you want to try to mimic existing taxes. So there are already gas taxes. If you have a carbon tax that layers on top of the existing taxes, in terms of administration, it makes it a lot easier. I asked the folks in British Columbia once how many people they have, how many FTEs, how many full-time employees they have working on the carbon tax. This covers administration, PR, everything about the carbon tax. They said 12 FTEs, which is astounding. Amazing low number. Right? So to the extent that you can piggyback on top of existing state tax systems, that's terrific. Coverage issues, I think, are important. The BC carbon tax does a couple of things that are worth thinking about expanding. So they do have great coverage. Basically, all the fossil fuels burned inside the province of BC are covered by the carbon tax. The carbon tax in BC does not cover the carbon content of imported electricity, what's called or carbon by wire. So if you have a power plant outside of the province, in Alberta, for example, that provides power to consumers and businesses inside of British Columbia, then that is not subject to the carbon tax. Okay. So you could think in Washington, Oregon, those issues are more important because we get a lot more power from out-of-state fossil fuel sources. And if you look at the amount of CO2 emitted in Oregon, I think the correct numbers are, if you just look at Oregon generation, it's about 10 million tons of CO2 per year from electricity generation. If you include imported power, it goes up to 20 million tons of CO2 per year. So it's an important issue, and it's important for thinking about sort of fairness and efficiency issues also. So that's an important issue to consider. The BC carbon tax essentially does not apply to jet fuel or to shipping fuel. That's something that's worth considering. It's a relatively, it's 5% of emissions or something like that, so it's not that big of a deal. But it's growing, and I think it's an important element to consider, and I would argue for inclusion of that. One thing that folks often talk about in Washington, I think this is a big issue in Oregon as well, is coal trains and oil trains, and can you apply a carbon tax to stop the coal trains, to stop the oil trains? And the answer that the lawyers tell me is no. Right? And this is not for any economic reasons, it's for constitutional reasons that have to do with interstate commerce. So I can't say anything more about that except to go talk to the lawyer people, but they seem to be pretty adamant about it, that's not something that you can do to deal with coal and oil train issues. So that's one of the legal issues. The interstate commerce issues also apply. You have to be careful when you're, to not, if you're taxing imported power that comes from out of state, to sort of think about how you're dealing with that. There may be some issues with whether gas taxes are constitutionally dedicated to roads in Washington and Oregon. There are some folks here from Citizen Climate Lobby I know, and they talk about a rebate system. So the idea is you have a carbon tax, you dividend the carbon tax revenue back to everybody in the state on a per capita basis. Washington state has a constitutional provision that says that the state cannot gift public funds except to the poor and infirm. And there are debates about what that means, but the folks that we talk to suggest that you're at risk in Washington state. I don't know how Oregon is, but in Washington state, those are the sorts of constitutional issues that you would need to think about. Think about revenue stability over time. So the BC carbon tax is frozen at $30 per ton of CO2. If you're trying to match increasing, so BC carbon tax is trying to match income tax reductions, and what they're seeing is the value of those income tax reductions are growing over time with inflation, with economic growth, with population growth, and so you need to do something either to increase the carbon tax or you need to reduce some of those tax reductions, which is what they've been doing in British Columbia, is they've been reducing the tax reductions to try to balance out and maintain revenue stability. So I would argue that raising the tax by about 4 or 5% a year would both provide good incentives for reducing carbon emissions and help you maintain revenue stability over time. Finally, there are a million political considerations you can think about. So in Washington, the governor's up for re-election in 2016, which is a year that a lot of people talk about for pushing carbon pricing issues. I think the situation politically is a little bit better here in Oregon. That's my view from the outside because Kitzhaber's up in 2014, so that clears the deck a little bit for 2016, I would suggest. But just to give you a sense of other political considerations, if you think about the geography of the state, right? Michael put up a couple of slides about the provision of electricity in Portland, and even just looking at the two providers in Portland, PGE and Pacific Power, you get differences of the impact of a carbon tax, right? Between it was a penny per kilowatt hour for Pacific Power and half of that for PGE. If you look at other parts of the state, if you go to like public power PUDs, so people's utility districts like Tillamook, basically they get a lot of power from the BPA, so they're getting a lot of hydro, a little bit of nuclear. They're going to be paying a reasonable ballpark, according to the numbers that we did. If you're looking at $30 per ton of CO2, is it the public folks who get their electricity from co-ops or from PUDs, other public power providers, are going to be paying about 0.2 cents a kilowatt hour more. Folks getting power from private sources, so you're talking principally Pacific Power and PGE, are going to be paying like 10 times that, about 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Right? So politically, that's an important issue. It's interesting, in the dynamics politically here in Oregon are a little different than in Washington. In Washington, Seattle City Light, for example, touts that the fact that they're carbon neutral, so a carbon tax would not have a whole lot of effect in Seattle or for a number of other places on the west side of the state, but it would be a relatively hard hit for places like Bellevue that get power from Puget Sound Energy, from some places on the east side of the state. I think the fact that Portland is actually served by some of these relatively dirty private utilities changes the political dynamics a bit, right? Potentially in a good way, because folks in Portland might be, much more okay with the idea of, okay, we should pay a little bit more and we should encourage our power providers to clean up. I'll mention briefly, I'm part of this group called Carbon Washington. So I think this is really fundamentally a political issue. So the idea of Pigouvian taxes, which Tom mentioned at the beginning, go back to the work of Arthur Pigou, and his book came out in 1920, so almost 100 years ago. The idea of let's tax bad things has been around for almost 100 years. The challenge has really been getting it into the political process, and that's one of the things that BC did that was amazing. I'm part of this grassroots group called Carbon Washington. We're targeting the November 2016 ballot, and just to give you a sense about how that's kind of looking, right? We're going to aim to file a measure in March of next year, collect signatures through December, and then put it in front of the state legislature, and then they could potentially, they'll probably put it on the ballot in November of 2016. So the last thing I want to say about this is I've been in this field for about 15 years, which is kind of amazing, practically since I learned about this idea of environmental tax reform when I was a junior at Reed. And I thought, oh, this is a really intellectually beautiful kind of idea that, and eventually it sort of took over my life. This is a super exciting time. Like in the 15 years I've been working on this, I've not seen this much energy and this many folks and people who are excited about this. So Washington and Oregon, I think both have really great opportunities, and I just encourage you all to get involved, both by following groups like Randy's Institute here at IEE, and also getting involved on the activist side of things. So Citizens Climate Lobby, which was tabling outside, does great work. OEC and Jana's organization does amazing work here in Oregon. They've done really fabulous work to move things forward here in Oregon. So I'd encourage you to get on somebody's email list. If you can write a check, write a check. But buy a book. But stay involved, and thank you for coming tonight, and thanks to Randy for helping to put this on.
Well, thanks to the panelists for those great presentations. I think they've covered a lot of the landscape, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions. If I could just ask to turn the lights up, please, over there. Fred, would it be possible to turn the lights on? Thank you. And so why don't we go ahead and take some questions. Why don't we try to group them together a little bit and get a few of them together, and then we'll let the panelists loose on them.
In BC, who decides how the revenue is going to be used? Is it the legislative process, or how do we do it?
So is that for your Jenny, or any of the panelists to take that?
Could you repeat the question?
So the question was, in BC, who decides on the carbon tax, right?
Who decides how the revenue is going to be
Who decides how the revenues are used?
My question is for the NUC presentation. So my question is, the transportation sector accounts for about 54% of the carbon emission in Oregon, and the employment in that industry is 2%. But I believe that in transportation, doesn't this account for the private vehicles that most people use? So if we are going to tax transportation, like public transportation, basically on this, actually we currently doing the opposite thing, because we should encourage actually public transportation like private services, and there is inconsistency, I think, in the conclusion we may come. So my question is that.
Okay. So isn't taxing transportation, especially public transportation, counterproductive?
That should be counterproductive, because actually we should discourage private vehicle transportation. I mean, like, if we can tax even private vehicles used, there will be efficiency in the mobility of the people, and that will reduce the carbon emissions, not by taxing the public transportation.
Okay. Maybe take one more and then we'll let the panelists answer.
Yeah, this is kind of related to that question. I'm wondering, with Oregon's constitutional limitation on taxes, anything that's used for propelling motor vehicles having to be used for road construction or maintenance, how do you envision that money actually being spent?
Very good, thank you. So it looks like Jenny and Yoram, perhaps.
Right, so to answer the first question about how BC decides on its revenue, their structure, their legislative or decision structure is very different. So in terms of how they decide on how to spend the revenue, it's part of their either Ministry of Finance that decides on this, but it is a black box process. So it's not a public and open process like we have here in the States. So there is very little that they can tell us about the specific process because it's just a different structure. So to kind of answer the other two questions on transportation fuel, so the way that we've structured our modeling for the carbon tax on transportation is that it actually is a tax on any combustible fuel. So it is a tax on private operation of private vehicles. So it does provide some incentives for people to switch to more fuel-efficient vehicles or to other ways of transportation. And yes, to your question, when we did our first study, we didn't fully consider the transportation fuel constitutional problem of where transportation-related fuel revenues would go. But from our continuing study and our conversations with ODOT as well as the legislative council is that, yes, all transportation fuel-related taxes need to go back into transportation, and that will really guide part of where that revenue is going in our second study. Yeah.
Yeah, I think with that last comment there, most likely what you would see with a carbon tax being implemented as a legislative bill, probably there would be a companion bill to change the Constitution to not, to exempt the carbon tax from the being dedicated to the roads and stuff. Most likely that would happen.
So two comments to add. One is in Washington State, I don't think we have the same issue with the state constitution. There is a similar provision, but the state Supreme Court just made a decision that I think made it clear that something like a carbon tax would not have to get dedicated to the highway funds. Oregon, I guess, is different. The other thing I'll say is just about the BC process. So Jenny put up some slides earlier that showed that the amount of revenue, the tax reductions from BC are always a little bit greater than the revenue that comes in from the carbon tax, and that's actually part of the design of the policy. So it's called revenue neutral, but there's actually a provision in the measure that says that every year the finance minister has to write a report about how much money came in from the carbon tax and how much goes out in offsetting tax reductions, and if the amount that comes in from the carbon tax is more than the amount that goes out in offsetting tax reductions, then the finance minister loses her salary. And that's, as an economist, I think that's kind of a really gimmicky thing to do, but when you talk to people about it, people love it. Like, politically, it was just super clever.
Other questions?
I'm convinced the best place for fossil fuels is in the ground, where it is, where it originates. And so think of the carbon tax as an inducement to decrease the amount of carbon that's transferred to the atmosphere. Why are we considering taxing consumers rather than taxing fossil fuels at the point of production?
So the question is just, why not just tax the fossil fuels at the point of production? Okay, maybe a couple more.
I was wondering how the RGGI states are, using their funds, or how this would compare with the cap and trade program, because with the goal that somebody mentioned about the goal of 75% reduction of carbon emissions by 2050, which even that is probably not ambitious enough if you look at the science. and that a carbon tax isn't going to get you anywhere near there in levels that people will tolerate. You know, is cap and trade, would we also need cap and trade, or is a cap and trade more feasible to get that kind of steep reduction?
Related question that is comparing cap and trade generally and things in between carbon tax and cap and trade.
Maybe one more. Yes, in the back.
I'm just curious from the NERC study and those different scenarios on the giving the money back, whether it's corporate level or the different side dishes, I guess, is how at the, I guess, the state level is that going to make sure that jobs are created in the state and that private corporations don't just siphon off tax revenue money and use it for whatever they want? I mean, is it really, how is it really directly linked to creating jobs and stimulating the economy here in Oregon? I guess is the question.
Well, let's see. Maybe we'll stop there for now. What about who wants to take the keeping fossil fuels in the ground, and why not just tax those?
I'll take that one for now. So I believe that the study is actually going to be looking at where you would put the tax in place. Most people are probably looking at putting it upstream, so on oil itself, on coal itself at the combustion point. But I think there's an acknowledgement that some of that cost would still be passed through to the customer. But I think administratively, it makes most sense to do it as far upstream as possible. And I think that's also where you start to get a change in some of those investment decisions. So it's true, maybe a 1 cent change in the price to the consumer isn't as much of an inducement. But when you're looking at investment decisions, if coal is that much more expensive, does that start to, level the playing field when you're going to the PUC with new projects or something like that? But I think the study is going to be looking at different places to levy that price.
So one thing to add on that in terms of trying to structure an Oregon carbon tax is that we don't do a lot of the extraction of the fossil fuels. So if we wanted to place a specific carbon tax on the extraction or taking out of these fossil fuels from the ground, we wouldn't be able to capture a lot of them if we were to structure it in that specific way. So kind of following off of what Jana said, we would be looking at is what is the most efficient administrative structure to apply the carbon tax, because as Yoram said, in BC they structured it to piggyback on a lot of the existing tax structures so that it would create the least administrative burden, and that's also what we are looking at here in Oregon.
Let me just briefly add. So, I mean, the economics is that taxes get passed back and forth independent of the legal incidence of the tax. So you could try to tax producers. Everyone would like to tax the big polluting companies and not tax little individuals and small businesses, but that's not really the way economics works, right? And the economics is that you could tax the refiners or whatever, but the tax would get passed on to consumers sort of through the forces of supply and demand. And from an environmental perspective, you want the taxes to get passed on because that's the incentive that people have to reduce their consumption. Right? If the tax is not passed along to the end users, then they're not going to change their demand.
What about the comparison of cap and trade and carbon taxes? Why don't we just do a cap and trade like neighbors?
I can comment quickly just about how some of the RGGI funds are being used. So RGGI, again, is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative with the northeastern states. And it varies state by state. Each state has control over how that revenue is spent. Many of them, Massachusetts, New York, others, they've invested in energy efficiency and renewable energy programs, and that has gained them additional emissions reduction. In fact, some people argue that's where the real meat of the emissions reductions have come. It's also created a lot of local job growth and economic benefits. Other states have used the funds to plug budget gaps. They haven't seen the same economic activity, but they felt that that was a state priority. So it has varied, but there is a really excellent analysis that was done looking at the economic impacts of the RGGI program. And the analytical group is not coming to me right now, but if you email me, I can pass it along. But it really has, it's the analysis group out of Boston. It's too obvious, the analysis group. And then California, I believe they're still coming up with their investment plan for the revenue.
Just to follow up and kind of segue into the next question about the comparison between cap and trade. Right now, California's cap and trade program just started last year, and it only concentrates on power producing utilities and the largest manufacturers. So right now it covers a very small portion of the economy. And the way that the cap and trade is structured is such that they have probably more permits than is needed. So at the current point, their carbon permit auction prices are only at $14 per ton, which, as you can see with a lot of our slides, show that that is not indeed the price that's going to get us to our emission goals in California or elsewhere. So, any other stuff to add?
So, from an economics perspective, roughly anything that you do with cap and trade, you can do with carbon taxes and vice versa. So the two policies in many ways are kind of mirror images of each other. So there are other factors that you should really focus on, I would argue, like what is the permit price in a cap and trade system, which is roughly similar to the tax rate in a carbon tax system. Those are more important issues to think about, I would argue, than whether you're doing a tax or whether you're doing cap and trade. And in fact, we've started talking about carbon pricing as an umbrella term to cover both taxes and cap and trade systems to try to get away from what I think is often kind of a divisive and relatively pointless argument about taxes versus cap and trade systems, because anything you do with one, you can do with the other. That's an important issue to think about, I would argue, because one of the comments that came along with the question was carbon taxes aren't going to get us where we need to go, in terms of emissions reduction, so maybe we should have a cap and trade system. If you had a cap and trade system that was going to achieve those same levels of emissions reductions, you would get permit prices that were very high. And you would encounter the same political difficulties that you think about when you say, okay, are we going to have a carbon tax that's going to add $2 to the price of gasoline, $200 per ton of CO2, roughly, right? So it's not like there's a magic bullet that comes from saying just because we're going to cap carbon emissions, there's going to be a price that comes out the other end of that, because that's how carbon pricing systems work. And you can't avoid the issues that come about from having a very strong cap corresponds to a very high price, and whether you do taxes or cap and trade, you got to deal with that. Now, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news all the time, so I have something positive to say. And the positive thing I have to say is that it's not as bad as you might think. So you look at these graphs that Jenny put up from the NERC study, and it looks like, wow, you need $60, $100, $200 per ton of CO2 just to get back to 1990 levels. Like, we're doomed, right? How are we going to do that? So what I want to encourage you to think about is the point, whether or not Oregon hits its carbon reduction goals is not super important to me. Whether Washington and California hits its carbon reduction goals is not super important to me. What's super important to me is setting a policy that's going to influence national action and international action in particular. And in both of those cases, nationally, especially internationally, $30 per ton of CO2, the BC level, is a lot more powerful than you think from looking at the graphs. And that's essentially because we have BC in particular is almost all hydropower. We have a lot of hydropower in the Pacific Northwest. Outside of the Pacific Northwest, nationally, especially when you look at internationally, the focus should not be on motor vehicles. So stop thinking about cars, stop thinking about gasoline, start thinking about electricity production, and start thinking about coal. $30 per ton of CO2 is 3 cents a kilowatt hour of coal-fired power. That is a lot. If you had $100 per ton of CO2, that might not get Oregon back to its 1990 levels, but $100 per ton of CO2 would internationally, if you could get that internationally, would kill coal internationally. It would probably kill natural gas internationally. I mean, I think of $100 per ton of CO2 as the holy grail. Like, if we could get that internationally, if we could get that internationally, we'd be done. Michael said that you shouldn't look for silver bullets, but if you could get $100 per ton of CO2 international carbon tax, you'd be done. That's my view of it. So it's not, the reduction numbers look challenging, but I don't think it's as dire as those numbers present. I'm going to pass this over to Michael so he can respond to that. Or maybe you should use
you'd be done with something, but I don't think you'd be done with kind of arriving at the prosperous, affordable, healthy world that we're looking for. So I don't disagree with it as a policy instrument. I just want to be really clear that we need to pair the policy instrument with both what we do with the revenue and the programs to support it, so that we make sure we get not just the carbon outcome we want, but all the rest. And so that's why I don't think we're quite done.
And I say that we want to be careful, too, that we don't get into this discussion where, heck, if I put in a carbon tax, why don't I take away the other regulations that we have that are either caps or, you know, clean fuels or whatever, because the carbon tax will take care of it. And I think we've shown that if you keep policy in place and even put in these carbon taxes, you're still not getting to the levels that you need to be. So it's not a debate to say, let's get rid of other regulation, we can put this in, but really this is another tool on top of the regulation we already have to try to decrease greenhouse gas emissions.
I'm going to disagree with that a little bit, which is just to keep in mind that in the political process, you got to make compromises sometimes. And if you think about, like, federally, how do we get a carbon tax federally? One of the arguments is we'd get a carbon tax federally by saying, well, if we had a carbon tax federally, then we could get rid of some of these onerous EPA regulations. In Washington State, we're looking at a clean fuel standard. There's, you know, a bunch of things that could potentially be on the table. So I think it's something to think about. I'm not saying that you want to necessarily give that stuff away, but it's something that's going to come up politically. It's something important to think about. Did you meet with Adele Morris in D.C. of Brookings Institution? So her idea is, instead of, you know, as a way for states to meet these targets under EPA regulations, they could use a carbon tax or a cap and trade system to meet those meet those standards. So I do think politically that those things are going to be on the table.
I just wanted to address the final question that was put out there, which was whether or not the way that carbon tax revenue dollars are repatriated, whether that actually creates economic development and job opportunities here in Oregon. So I have to be honest with you that our first study really didn't take a very close look at it. We had very limited resources to address that. So, so we assume that these jobs are going to be created here in Oregon according to our analysis. But right now what we are looking at is how do we structure the money that goes back to corporations, be it an income tax cut or some kind of structure to make sure that the employment opportunities exist here in Oregon and not elsewhere. So that's part of what we are exploring right now in talks with various stakeholders and labor groups here in Oregon.
Other questions? Let's see. Right. Yeah, in the back, yes. I was. And then you. Okay, go ahead, please.
I guess I have a two-part question. I guess on a state level, how do we exactly account for that carbon by wire issue? And especially considering that, you know, in about a decade, Boardman will shut down its coal utilization. So we're looking at a lot more coal plants being still in the region, but not directly in Oregon. Mm-hmm. And I guess more generally, in the utilities scenario-based planning that they're doing in their integrated resource plans, what types of prices are they putting on carbon for those projections at this point?
Back to kind of the political feasibility thing, would you consider maybe reducing or increasing the carbon tax for certain sectors to maybe start the political movement along?
So, yeah. To differentiate by sector?
Yeah.
To differentiate the tax rate by sector?
Yeah.
Very excellent question.
Yeah, a comment en route to a question, and let me just plug the Sideline Institute and the work Yoram has done there. I actually think that's one of the best sources out there nationally. We're actually really lucky to have Sideline looking so closely at our region. Not all regions have a Sideline Institute, so it's a great resource that I recommend to everyone. I want to start by reiterating Yoram's comment about the importance of the price. I think this is actually very unfamiliar to us when we think about fiscal policy. We typically think about the whole purpose of levying a tax is to collect revenue. That's kind of beside the point here. I really want to emphasize that point that Yoram made. Right? The point is to send a price signal that's currently absent. And I guess the question I ask at the end of that is that because what we spend the money on is, frankly, a little bit beside the point, certainly compared to most fiscal policy, I'd like to hear some guidance from the panel about good things to do in terms of entree and side dishes and bad things. And I already know one thing Yoram's going to say. Anything that suppresses a price signal is probably a bad thing, maybe a terrible thing, maybe entirely. Sorry to put words in your mouth, but I think we have to figure out like what are those things that actually will undermine the mechanism itself. That doesn't mean that we can't buy people off politically in a totally legitimate sense. That sounds bad, but that's what we're talking about. It doesn't mean we can't buy people off politically, but let's talk about those things that buy people off politically without undermining the mechanism itself.
Okay, I think we got a lot to work with there. So, carbon by wire and Boardman.
So we have a lot of hydropower here in Oregon, as with the rest of the Pacific Northwest. We get so the main types of utilities here in Oregon, there are the larger investor-owned utilities that serve Portland, for example, PGE and Pacific Power, and then there's a small portion served by Idaho Power out on the east side. These are our only three investor-owned utilities that operate their own electricity producing facilities. They have coal plants outside of Oregon as well as Boardman here in Oregon. But the rest of the state have power that's provided by consumer-owned utilities like the PUDs that Yoram was talking about. And most of these actually get most of their power from BPA, which means that it is almost all hydro. Okay, so this carbon by wire problem possibly only applies to a very, very small portion of electricity that we import here into Oregon. And because the carbon by wire, so when we import electricity from out of state into the state, it is done on a market exchange. So there's an electricity market where they buy and sell power. There is almost no way to trace the power back to where it came from. So, so at this point, we are in conversation with the Public Utilities Commission as well as the other utilities and other stakeholders, but we're finding that this carbon by wire is going to be very, very difficult to almost impossible to deal with because of the structure of the electricity market, but then it also makes up a very, very small percentage of the power that's imported into Oregon. And there is power imported that we know where it comes from because Pacific Power, for example, owns electricity plants in multiple states. We know where that comes from, but if they're buying power on the market, then we don't know where it comes from. So that's kind of my overall response to that question.
I'm not convinced that it's such a small problem here in Oregon, and it's certainly a big issue elsewhere. I'll say two things. One is in Washington, we do have utilities are required to report their energy mix. So we do have, I don't know whether Oregon has something similar, but we do have reporting in Washington. They do have something similar in Oregon, yeah. Whether or not that's accurate because of what Jenny mentioned is exactly correct, that you can't track the electrons back to individual power plants necessarily, so that complicates matters. But there are numbers out there from these fuel mix disclosure reports that we have in Washington State. I also think California has dealt with this. So California's cap and trade system is actually a consumption-based measure. So we're actually in the process, my colleagues at Sightline and I are in the process, we're writing this blog series about carbon pricing focusing on the Pacific Northwest, and we're looking at California, and one of the questions we're looking at is, okay, how do they do that? How do they do that consumption-based measure? So whether it's exactly right according to the physics is unclear, but legally, like they've done something, so we'll figure it out.
I want to call on the collective wisdom of the audience. Does anyone know what the IRP carbon prices are? Angus, Duncan, any?
For PGE and PacifiCorp?
Yeah.
I've seen the PGE IRP relatively recently, the draft from late last year, and they model different prices.
Yeah, it's usually a range.
I don't think any of the prices get, correct me if I'm wrong, someone knows, I don't think any of them get as high as 60, but lots of them get into the teens and 20s, 30s.
Yeah.
No one gets 100, I'm sorry.
No one gets 100. But I think in the past, in the near term, prices were higher than they had, than 30. I think they probably have revised those numbers. Bill, do you know off the top of your head either?
I think in the 30 range.
30 range, yeah. Congratulations, you stumped the panel on that question. I just wanted to comment on this idea of sectoral price differences, which I think is actually a potentially interesting concept because different sectors respond differently to different price signals. So I think that's worth probably investigating and looking into. I don't have the answer to what that looks like, but I will comment on another proposal. This was something that was proposed at the federal level. Most carbon tax or carbon price programs start at a lower price and then march their way upward over time. So you have a certainty in what that price signal will be. There was a proposal that looked at indexing it to the outcome that you want, and in this case, carbon reductions. And so the proposal was that each year the price would rise $10 per ton. But if our environmental performance was getting ahead of schedule, you maybe only increase that price 5%, or $5 per ton. So it rewards early innovation, and it also responds to the idea that there is going to be technological innovation that we can't anticipate now that could make all this more efficient and more effective than we maybe anticipate sitting where we are today. And I think that's another kind of interesting idea that could be out there. So can you do pricing indexed to the outcome that you want?
I'll chime in 2 cents about the idea of having different tax levels for different sectors of the economy. So the economics of it is that you don't want to do that, right? So you want to try to keep it simple. You want to try to provide the same incentives for everybody because what you're trying to do is find least cost emissions reductions. And if you have different tax rates for different sectors of the economy, then you're not going to get that. So the economics is you want to try to keep it simple. Having said that, if you look at the politics, I mean, the thing that's amazing about BC is that the BC carbon tax actually approximates what you would read about in an economics textbook. That is extremely unusual. You look at like what's happening in California. So California right now has a carbon price for utilities and large facilities, large industrial facilities. They're supposedly talking about extending that to transportation fuels in 2015. So in BC, they've actually provided. BC has. In the last year, they created a small exemption for the hothouse tomatoes that you may purchase at the store that are grown in British Columbia. If you wonder how they grow hothouse tomatoes in British Columbia, it's with a lot of natural gas. And so they provided an exemption for them from the carbon tax. So politically, that may be an interesting idea politically. The economics of it is that you don't want to do that, though.
It seems to segue very well into the last question, which is what about using the revenue and undermining the incentives and just messing up your objectives because you're getting too complicated with the use of the revenues?
I'll give a small example from California again. So my understanding is that in California, the utilities are required to use the money from a carbon tax to offset impacts on ratepayers, but you can do that in one of 2 ways. You can do that by lowering the cost of electricity per kilowatt hour, which defeats the point of the carbon tax, or you can do what I think PGE, this is not Portland General Electric, but Pacific Gas and Electric in California does, which is just give everybody a flat reduction in their electricity prices, which maintains the correct marginal incentives. So I think there are smart ways to repatriate the revenue that aren't going to destroy the incentives from a carbon price.
So just to kind of reiterate what Yoram has said, is that any repatriation scheme to not destroy the price incentive of a carbon tax to incent people to switch to less carbon intensive energies is that it has to be decoupled from their usage of carbon fuels or electricity. So it will definitely destroy the price signal if, say, on your electricity bill you see that, oh, there's a carbon tax on there, and then I get money back that offsets that carbon tax. It doesn't do anything, and it destroys the basic premises of the policy to begin with. So anything that is good needs to decouple the signal from the repatriation.
Yeah, I would argue what we want is a carbon price that does lead to some sort of meaningful emissions reductions. I would argue that a portion of the revenue absolutely has to be dedicated to low-income households and not burdening people who are already disproportionately burdened. I also think, based on the RGGI example, that reinvesting in emission-reducing activities is also really important, and it's a good carbon bang for our buck. So additional energy efficiency programs, climate-smart infrastructure. We know that we already have to spend, trillions of dollars to maintain the infrastructure we have. To make it climate-smart, climate-safe will be, marginal increase over that, but I think that's a really smart investment as well.
Let me add one quick thing about that. I was just in Maine talking with some folks there, including Tom Tietenberg, who's an amazing environmental economist at Colby College, talking about RGGI, which he helped design. And I'm about as big of a proponent as you will find for the idea of revenue-neutral carbon taxes. I like that it's simple. I like that it's clear. I like that it appeals across the political spectrum. But I was pretty stunned at how positive Tom in particular was in talking about the use of RGGI funds for energy efficiency programs. And he's an economist. And so having that come from an economist was pretty powerful for me. So I clearly need to do some more research on that, some more thinking about that. But that idea of using revenue to fund energy efficiency programs for households and for businesses came out a lot more positive than I thought it would from looking at RGGI. So +1 for that.
So just to pile on briefly, I think that's right on. And we are modeling some options for providing assistance to low-income households. I think, obviously, improving the energy efficiency in low-income households is there's the holy grail with a $100 carbon tax to make it all possible. Then I'm with you. So, I really want to underscore, in Multnomah County, we have something approaching 100,000 houses with no insulation in them. There are big opportunities to improve the efficiency of those homes. The City of Portland worked with others to help start Clean Energy Works. They're providing good jobs to get those homes retrofit. There are some really compelling things that are already happening. We need more resources to do it. And carbon taxes, like pretty much every tax, most taxes, it's regressive. And we want to be clear that we need to deal with that up front. I really like this notion of there's the entree and then there are the side dishes, and which ones you use to build political will for this versus which ones you deal with some policy issues. It's nice to have that flexibility, which is perhaps the only good thing to say about a tax. So I think there's good potential, but I really would underscore that we need to deliver big energy efficiency benefits with this, and those are some of the best investments that pay for themselves. So there's every opportunity to get economic value out of it.
I just have one more point to add, just to put a little bit more context to why we really want to include some kind of low-income support in this kind of carbon tax repatriation. Just for context, the lowest quintile of households in terms of income here in Oregon spend 20 to 25% of their household expenditures on energy. And that number is less than 10% of household expenditures for the highest earning quintile of the population. So you can see that this will definitely more heavily impact the lowest income populations of the state. So I just wanted to emphasize that particular point with some numbers.
I think we have so it sounds like the revenues matter. So that's the revenue, use of the revenues does matter. Maybe we could have another round perhaps. Hey, right there.
I've read that $15 for a gallon of gas burned is going to be the total cost by 2050. So essentially we're getting 30 cents or 60 cents and we're going to be paying $15 for every gallon. Is that true or is that totally off?
Okay, you're going to end up paying $15 a gallon.
Oh, I'm curious, the federal government currently sets a social cost of carbon, which I'm not sure I know what that number is. I think, what, $37 is the central value, something like that. So, would you imagine the carbon tax to actually effectively stay below that number to be economically efficient? Do you think that's a true cost of carbon cost, or would you think that the carbon tax might eventually drive that number up ultimately because of the desired outcome needs to be at the higher levels?
Maybe right there.
I was curious about. I'm very new to this whole thing, so bear with me. But why wouldn't it be economically feasible to repatriate those funds into an energy efficient thing like they're doing over on the East Coast. I guess I'm kind of confused just because it makes it more complicated. Seems like you get kind of a double pro in that sense because you'd be getting rid of carbon emissions and then using the money that you get from the revenue from that to further decrease carbon emissions. So I'm kind of confused why that's not a feasible option.
That's a great question. Last question.
I'm curious, here we are in Oregon, and we all probably are pretty sympathetic to this whole idea, but there's also a state that defeated a proposal to raise the gas tax by 5 cents a gallon going to roads. And how are you guys doing in Washington? How is this polling? How do you think it'll poll? Is there any chance that these Katrina, Sandy, other events will move public opinion enough to make this even, feasible outside this room?
All right, we've got a lot to work with there. How about this $15 a gallon of gas? Sounds pretty scary.
Are you talking about the social costs of the gallon of gas? Or are you talking about the actual cost at the pump?
So my understanding is that right now, every year, 3 million people die worldwide directly from climate change. And that the same way when you drive a car to the coast and back, if your friend drives, you could chip in $10 for cost on top of gas. The cost from carbon in gas is $15 on top of every gallon by 2050.
So I guess this question connects with the second question asking about the social cost of carbon. So I think what this gentleman was referring to in terms of the social cost of carbon are all the externalities that are associated with carbon production related to climate change effects. And the numbers that were quoted are from an intergovernmental, interagency work group by the US government to look at what is the social cost of carbon. And I think the newest estimates that came out last year were around, the central value was increased slightly. I think it is maybe 30 something or 40, $37. But it was a range. Yeah, there was a range. Sorry, Tom, did you want to jump in?
Oh, I was just going to say, yes. In 2007 dollars, it was $37 average. If you put in 2011 dollars, another study just upped it a little bit. Now you're hitting about 40.
So kind of to add on that, that is just one study that is done by the government work group, and it's most scientists and economists tend to think of it as a rather conservative measurement. So if you looked at the academic literature that looks at the social cost of carbon, depending on what kind of climate change modeling you do and what are the assumptions associated, it can actually range anywhere from that number up to, say, $100 or $200 per ton. So it is a rather unsure number as of this point.
So maybe $15 a gallon might be.
Yeah, I haven't necessarily heard that number as related to the social cost of carbon for a gallon of gas, but I have heard some members of the armed forces say that the true cost for a gallon of gas is more in the $15 range when you factor in, defending supplies around the world. So, for what that's worth.
I mean, just to play off of this $15 a gallon number, so let's say $5 a gallon is the actual market price, then you're talking about external costs of $10 a gallon. That's roughly $1,000 per ton of CO2 is the social cost of carbon. For 2050, is that unreasonable? I don't think so. I think that there are probably some estimates now that put the social cost of carbon at $1,000 per ton of CO2, but keep in mind, that, as Jenny said, the social cost of carbon estimates are all over the map, and I basically think they're worthless. No, I mean, the honest truth is that we don't know how bad climate change is going to be. We don't know. We are pushing the planet into areas that we haven't experienced for millions of years, and it's unreasonable to expect scientists, natural scientists, and then layer on top of that the economic analysis with adaptation and mitigation and whatever to come up with reasonable numbers. So the estimates for social cost of carbon that I've seen are everywhere from approximately 0 to something like $1,000 per ton of CO2, with 37 being the central estimate. But it's an incredibly wide range.
I don't know if other people want to comment on, and maybe Michael, about the use of carbon revenue going to energy efficiency funds. I don't think there's any reason why it can't. I think it's just a matter of political will about what we want to do with those revenues. And I know that from polling on this issue, when you ask people what should be done with the carbon revenue, people like to pin the use of those funds to the problem itself. So more investments in energy efficiency and more investments in renewables are often very popular options. So make it happen, people who vote.
Can I say something about, sorry, I'm chiming in on that, but I want to answer the specific question about, if you look at RGGI, so the concern that I have about it, and I do have concerns about it, is you're talking about a vast pile of money, and the question is whether the government can spend that vast pile of money well in a particular and relatively small sector of the economy. So you take RGGI permit prices are $5 per ton of CO2, and they only apply to electricity. So now let's multiply by 6 to get $30 per ton of CO2, and multiply by 2 or more to take it from electricity to the whole carbon economy, right? So you're talking about a factor of 10 increase in revenue to go from RGGI, which has apparently spent the money very well, right? But once you start scaling up carbon taxes, if you get $30 per ton of CO2 like in British Columbia that applies to the whole economy, you're talking about maybe 10 times more revenue than they got in RGGI. That is a vast sum of money. And the challenge I have is, can you spend that money well? And I'm not sure the answer is yes.
The thing I was going to note is pretty similar, where the Energy Trust of Oregon's current budget is something on the order of $170 million a year. And so the carbon tax is going to raise, what was? $2 billion. About 1 to 2 billion. Yeah, so, you know, 1.5 billion, 2 billion. So it would change things by an order of magnitude. So we should do that and do some other things too.
I would also note, though, it doesn't have to be a single use at the end, right? If you have $1 to $2 billion, what portion of that, which is why I think the original NERC study was so interesting in looking at what's the combination of end uses. Is there some tax shifting? Is there some reinvestment, which could be in something like energy efficiency? Plus, how do you take care of low-income households? So looking at that unique mix that would work really well for Oregon's economy.
Yeah, you remember it's this double dividend aspect. The first dividend is you put on the carbon tax, you get greenhouse gas emissions reduced. What do you do with the revenue is then the second dividend is that you reduce the costs on things you don't really want to tax a lot, people's incomes, doing business costs. So if you direct it all at energy efficiency, you'll get probably some more greenhouse gas emission reductions, but as was mentioned here, how much more would you actually get? And most likely, what we might call the negative economic effects of the economy, of jobs and so on, of putting an extra cost on the households and on businesses through the tax, but not giving any other tax relief elsewise, we may have a net job loss situation. But if that's okay, I mean, it's what you're seeing as a society that you want. If you really want greenhouse gas emissions down very dramatically, very quickly, well, there's a consequence of doing that.
I don't know if we want to do one last comment about the politics of all of this, which of course is also what matters. We can have a lot of theoretical conversations about this. But I think there's a couple of really interesting and exciting things to note. Well, one, I think we are at a unique place in overall revenue reform conversations. The governor is having conversations with business, with labor, with other stakeholder groups. How do we get our arms around some of the revenue challenges that we face in the state? And because we have some great analysis already, I think carbon tax is a part of that conversation. Is it, the end-all be-all solution? No. Is it a certain thing? No. But I think the more we can let elected officials and other people know that we think it's worthwhile to have discussions around this, the more probable it certainly does become. Certainly the revenue discussion is going to be a big part. What we do with those funds will make or break the political feasibility of it as well. But there's a really interesting and exciting citizens movement around these issues as well. I think people are starting to see and feel the impacts of climate change in new ways. People are looking for comprehensive solutions that they can wrap their minds around, and this seems like a more straightforward solution. And it feels like it's up to the challenge of meeting the magnitude of the problem. And I think we're going to start to see more and more movement. The Citizens Climate Lobby has been mentioned. 350 PDX is also interested in organizing around these issues. Certainly a lot of the policy groups who have been at the table are interested in really diving into this. So, you know, we live in a representative democracy. Your voices matter a whole lot as well. So if this is something you're interested in, I strongly encourage you to make sure that you get involved and make your voices heard.
In quick comment in general, I don't want to give the impression that, you know, economists are these really cold people and everything is in a cost-benefit analysis. You know, it's not like, you know, we don't look at murder and say, well, you know, what's the cost of the victims and what's the benefit to the person that murdered somebody? If the benefit's higher, then maybe we should have murder. You know, so
we should tax murder.
We should tax murder. So what I mean is that, you know, as we look at this, we're trying to do it in a realistic, we think, with the political arena and everything else, but we know at the end of the day, something's got to be done. And so that's our real end goal there. But how can we get it through legislators, get it through, you know, the political process, and at least get a start to get the ball rolling?
Okay, well, it seems that we're out of time. So if anyone would like to press the panel on some other points, please do it. You see, there's videotaping going. So this should be available at least on the IE website, maybe elsewhere, for those who weren't able to be here. Thank you for coming. Join us next week for Dave Irvin on genetic engineering, and thank the panel.